This is history on stage. The evolution of gospel music, created by Karen Burke and Corey Butler of the Toronto Mass Choir, shares the history of an art form Burke is truly passionate about.
Painters use material, or they use canvas, and dancers use their body and, music, etc., etc. But music doesn't need anything in order to exist. It actually doesn't exist outside of the mechanisms inside of our ear. The way that God has gifted us with music is that it starts, as I said before, in the soul of one person, and it's transmitted through the air, if you will, to another person and resides there. This is my prayer.
This is my prayer.
Growing up, Burke says gospel gave her a connection to her roots.
I was raised in a small town that didn't have very many black people there, and my only connection to my blackness, if you will, was my church and the music in our church. If it wasn't for that, my life would have been quite different. And so gospel music has always been a soundtrack in my life, no matter what I was doing.
And what she's been doing is teaching her students at York University in Toronto, Ontario, where gospel as we know it today comes from.
The first thing I say to them when they come into class is, when I'm talking about gospel music in this class, I'm talking about that music which is rooted in African roots, African music roots. And I said, and that also I'm going to concentrate on African American artists. So I said, I will not be teaching about Elvis Presley, okay, or the Gaithers. I mean, they have enough publicity. What I'm going to do is teach you about the people whose shoulders they stand on.
And those shoulders, Burke says, are the shoulders of slaves.
Gospel music has its roots in the story, the tragic story of slavery, the biggest migration of peoples in history across water. And the culture in West Africa, where these people are coming from, was steeped with music. Every part of their lives was accompanied by music. Rituals, ceremonies, work, play. When they came over, they were stripped of everything else, their identity, their freedom. The music is something that they couldn't be taken away from them. And so they brought those things and that love of music and the way that they do music with them.
West African music traditions were infused with the gospel when slave owners decided to introduce their slaves to the Bible.
They would gather them up on a Sunday morning, and they would have them captive audience with the pastor, and he would share the stories that they wanted him to share, which were Old Testament stories. And they have all those things, slave obey your master, and all those good things that Christians should do.
While slave owners had their own intentions for sharing the gospel, the slaves, however, heard a different message.
They didn't realize is that the same stories they were telling about Israelites in the Red Sea and the parting of the Red Sea. They heard those stories, but what they heard was what happened, that Pharaoh died at the end, and that eventually freedom would come. So their interpretation of the Old Testament stories, they started to appropriate in their own language in terms of taking those hymns or those stories and imbuing their own way of singing with these stories.
By marrying traditional West African music and biblical scripture, a genre of music known as the spiritual was born.
And so you see spirituals becoming a picture of their hopes, and they embodied the same kind of pentatonic scale that they would have been singing all the way along. A pentatonic scale is a 5-note song, and all of the basic spirituals are based on it. Like Amazing Grace uses the same 5 tones. Ba da 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 da. Most spirituals, da 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 dee dee dee. They have the same 5 notes, and that sound is as African-based.
Slaves used spirituals as a means of upliftment, believing that one day they'd be free. But spirituals also had another purpose.
Spirituals were also ways of, had coded meanings, double meanings, right? Yeah. So that people were using them as a way to communicate.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
That was a song that they would sing, often to announce that someone else was coming to take them out of slavery, or to help them to escape from slavery. One of the most famous conductors was Harriet Tubman. And Harriet Tubman is given the celebration of the fact that she took about 300 people. So she would escape and then she would go back and she'd bring more people and go and take them north. And so they would call these people the conductors or whatever, and they would use the term chariot as a symbol for these people that would come.
From the bottom of your soul.
Though millions enjoy the music, most people, Burke says, don't know its history. She wants to change all that. With music an integral part of many black churches, the evolution of gospel music traces the history of the genre. Against the backdrop of the hopeful and often brutal lives of black people in North America, the show illustrates the changes in gospel music through theater and dance. The production goes through 5 eras of gospel music.
Those 5 areas are spirituals, pre-gospel, which is Thomas Dorsey, and then the golden era of gospel, and then the when gospel was gospel, and then the and now section.
Spirituals became known to the wider population through groups like the Fisk Jubilee Singers, a group of free students who toured to raise money for Fisk University, the first American university to offer a liberal arts education to people of color.
On the Lord I'm gonna wait, on the Lord I'm gonna wait, on the Lord till he comes.
Thomas Dorsey is credited for being the father of gospel music. Initially a secular blues singer known as Georgia Tom, Dorsey became a Christian and combined his love for the blues with a Christian message.
And at the beginning, the other Christians around did not like it at all. You know, he was like the Kirk Franklin of his day, I guess, you know, and doing something new with this music that they considered to be not Christian, right? But today, I mean, he's known as the father of gospel music.
The golden age of gospel music saw the rise of singers like Mahalia Jackson, James Cleveland, and quartets like the Soul Stirrers, whose members included the great Sam Cooke. During that time, gospel music also became the backdrop of the civil rights movement.
I think that gospel music continued to be the voice of the people. I mean, spirituals were an expression of their struggle, and again, giving hope and giving instruction. And that it's just never left that place. It's never left that place. And so all the way along, no matter how African Americans were struggling, the music was always a soundtrack for that. And it's what kept them together, gives them hope.
In the 1970s and 80s, gospel music developed a more contemporary sound with artists like Andre Crouch, the Hawkins Family, and the Winans. These days, almost every major record label has a gospel division. Burke isn't bothered by the mainstreaming of gospel, but says artists should be careful.
One of these good sayings is that if you're going to cross over, take the crossover. I think that gospel artists have to be very careful that because they have the ear of the public. And so if you're going to have it, then say something worthwhile. Say something that is scripturally based, and say something that's true, and say something that honors God and speaks about God.
Despite its popularity, Burke says that misconceptions about gospel music still exist.
I mean, one thing is I used to think that everybody who sang gospel music was Christian. Well, it's not the case. And also that it is only a black thing. I get that all the time. You know, people, I can't join your choir because it's this, or I can't sing, or I can't use gospel music in my church because there's no black people in my church. And I said to them, do you know I've been to Poland? Poland, there are no black people in Poland. And I said, and they have lots of gospel music.
In Canada, Burke says, gospel music isn't as popular as it is in the U.S.
I think it's great that it's come to a place where when you say it, at least people have a sense of what it is. In Canada, we have a ways to go for people to actually experience it. Many times, even 20 years, Toronto Mass Choir, I've been doing this, many times we go places the first time I've ever seen a gospel choir or any kind of gospel choir experience.
Recently, the Toronto Mass Choir celebrated its 20th anniversary. Burke and the choir are working to make room for the next generation of Canadian gospel artists.
I'm very, very pleased at this next generation of musicians coming up in the church that are not just keeping their music in church, but they are going to school and learning how to be a better drummer, a conductor, a better singer.
For now, Burke says she'll continue to share her faith by sharing her music.
I've seen life-changing effects. Often when we do work for God, we plant the seed and we never can see what happens. So many times I've seen it happen, and people will come back and testify what's happened to them. If you have someone's ear, you have their heart, you have their soul. So you have a responsibility then to put good things in their ear.
For more information on the York University and Toronto Mass Choirs, visit crossroads.ca. For 100 Huntley Street, I'm Bridget Antwi.